Cheryl, did you get a handout? Anybody else need a handout? I'm talking about the paper on the thing, not money.
Is this the only handout?
For today, sorry. All right. Let's wait for Sean. He's going to start the video. First of all, thanks. I'm so glad to see everybody here. Acts is one of my favorite books in the Bible. That doesn't make it without its problems and challenges, which we're going to talk about. But I love the book of Acts. Always have since I was a kid. Because it tells about adventures, right? A lot of adventures and stories. So, all right. So before we start, let's pray. Gracious God, Jesus taught us that the Spirit would be our teacher and that we should invite the Spirit to teach us. And so we do that now. Help us to see and hear what will be helpful to us, what will deepen our trust in your grace and mercy. So we pray this in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so the book of Acts. The book of Acts. Anybody know, don't look, how many chapters in the book of Acts? 28. Joyce gets a star. It's 28. All right, so what I'm going to do today is just hit some of the high points about the background material that we need to know, because once we know that, I think we'll understand what is in the book of Acts and what the message is and what isn't there. What isn't there? Because there's a lot that isn't. Okay? So what kind of document? Remember, our Bible is not a book. Everybody say that. The Bible is not a book. It is a library, right? It is a collection of books. And the New Testament are the documents that were written and collected. And by the way, they had lots of fights about what should be in the New Testament that came after the time of Jesus. All of the stuff before Jesus is called the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament, right? But it's actually called the Hebrew Bible. That came before Jesus. That was Jesus' Bible, right? Everybody get that clear? And the stuff in the New Testament came after Jesus. And the book of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles is its official name, is in the New Testament. All right? So what kind of document or what kind of book is the book of Acts? There's Gospels, there's letters, right? Paul's stuff is all letters. Even the book of Romans, it's a letter, believe it or not. It's a letter. It feels like a theological book, but it's actually a letter, right? The book of Acts is a little different. So what would you say if I said, what kind of a document is it? What would you say? Anybody?
It's a history.
It's got a lot of history in it, right? It tells a story. It tells the story. It's a memoir, right? So it's not like a gospel that tells about the life of Jesus. This is more of a memoir, a history of 36, I believe I'm right, 36 years. 36 years of history are tucked inside the Acts of the Apostles. And I'll say more about that in a second. But it's about what happened. About what theological issues and disputes and squabbles came up. What did they do? How did they live? All of this is in the book of Acts. The Jesus movement, by the way, they weren't called Christians. They used the word church, but not the way we think of church. The gathered community. Were they primarily, at least the first part of Acts, were they primarily Jews or Gentiles? Jews. Almost exclusively Jews. Okay? Hold that in your head. Do not forget that. The early movement was a Jewish movement. It was a Jewish sect. It was a sect within Judaism. A sect that followed Jesus of Nazareth. Okay? There had been other sects that followed messiahs. This sect followed Jesus. He did not turn out to be the kind of Messiah that anybody expected. But in the book of Acts, something overwhelming happened to them, and that's why they continued following. At least that's what I say. All right. So, what kind of document is the book of Acts. It's a historical record, but it's also, it does more than just tell history. It has there's theological messages in it. So it's like a theological memoir. So it's a record of this, what they often call the Nazarene movement, because Jesus was a Nazarene. The Nazarene movement, sometimes known as the Way, following his crucifixion in Jerusalem, and those appearance stories that we talked about, those weeks after the crucifixion, where his followers had bizarre, what I believe were mystical experiences. 8 of them are recorded. That's where it starts. Where does it end? Anybody have an idea? Where does the book of Acts, what's the events at the end of the book of Acts? 36 years later. Marianne?
Paul is in Rome.
He is in Rome.
And so is Peter.
Yeah.
And they don't know what happened.
Yeah. Here's the weird thing about the book. By the way, most of the book is about Paul. 2/3 of the book is about Paul. So he says it's the Acts of the Apostles, but much of it is about Paul and his ministry. That's the first thing. But the book ends, and it appears when Luke wrote this, I gave that away, we'll talk about that in a second. When it was written, the person who wrote it does not appear to be aware of Paul's execution. It ends, Paul was imprisoned twice in Rome. And one of them was like a house imprisonment because he was being watched, but he was living on his own, which I find kind of strange. But remember, Paul was a Roman citizen, right? But it appears that the book ends between his first and second imprisonment. What happens after the second imprisonment?
They think he was beheaded.
They think he was beheaded under which Roman emperor? Nero. Okay? So that's the time frame. Right after Jesus' crucifixion, and probably 2 years, probably not any more than that, before Paul was executed. That's the time frame. Okay? It's also a theological memoir, because he puts in there the theological controversies. Why did the theological controversies arise?
It's over circumcision.
Yeah, because this movement, which began as a Jewish movement, started to attract what? Gentiles, non-Jews. All right? I'll talk more about that. But that's a lot of what the theological squabbles were about. What do we do with these people who are not ethnic Jews? Okay? I have included, and I talked about the time period, yeah, okay. I have included there several dates. The last date's on the second page, I think. No, that's not true. Or yes, it is. The dates in the middle with the italics, that's the time period that the book of Acts covers. Does that make sense? So some of the important things before it were, number one, way back, long before Jesus was born, 63 BC, Palestine, Judea was conquered by the Roman, it became a territory of the Roman Empire, as the Roman Empire expanded, right? And that's when they began, the Jewish people, and the Samaritans and all the other people who lived there, were living under conquest. They were a conquered people under the Romans, right? It was at 37 BC that the empire named their first emperor, and whose name was Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus. And remember, at the same time, there were Roman empires, but they kind of employed local, sometimes called kings or governors. So back then, kings, it's not the way we think of kings today. Kings may have been king of a city-state or whatever, but they were employed by the Roman government to run things. And one of the most important was Herod the Great, who was partly Jewish. He was a bad dude, And Herod was king of the Jews of Judea when who was born? When Jesus was born. And remember, it was Herod, the Jewish king, or partly Jewish king, working for the Romans, who killed all the baby boys. Why did they kill all the baby boys? Because the astrologers came from the east and said, we have seen the lineup in the stars, and we know a very special baby has born, a potential king. And Herod was like, tell me more, tell me more. And then he decides, there will be no other king but me. And that's that terrible story in the book of Matthew. Herod was the dude that did that. He was a bad guy. So towards the end of the reign of Herod, 3 people are born, important people in the New Testament. John the Baptist, Jesus of Nazareth, and also Paul, who at that time was born as Saul, remember? Before he was Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus. He lived up in the city up near Turkey called Tarsus. They're all born about this time, somewhere between 5 BC and 0. All right? So those 3 were all about the same age. We think of John the Baptist as being an old guy and Jesus being young. That's not the way it was. It's not true. They were somehow related. They were probably distant cousins, but they were close to the same age. But also remember that before Jesus came on the scene, before Jesus' ministry really took off, John the Baptizer was sort of the reigning prophet of the people. He was not acknowledged or certified by the temple authorities. John was a thorn in their side, as was Jesus. They operated outside the official temple system. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. So anyway, scoot on down, and you can see that when Jesus was a teenager, a young teenager, the Roman emperors changed, right? He went from Caesar Augustus to Tiberius. So already there's a change in the emperors, okay? And that we think, and we can't be exact on most of these dates, but roughly, John's ministry was 20 to 29, somewhere in there. Maybe a little shorter, don't know for sure. Jesus' ministry, we all think Jesus ministered for 3 years. People, we're not certain about that. It was probably somewhere between 2 and 3. We don't know for sure. But it could have been as short as 2. But it was close to the end of Jesus' ministry that John was executed. Remember the horrible story? Herod's son, he was a bad guy too. He beheaded John at a party and served his head on a platter. Remember that horrible story? So jump down, and all the italics are the dates that are inside the book of Acts. Okay? And I'm not going to go through all of them all, but you can see that they had 2 or 3 more changes of Roman emperors. You can look at Paul's mission to the Gentiles. It wasn't as long as you think. And then we know for sure, and I'm going to talk a lot about this, we know for sure that Paul was made to stand in front of the Jerusalem leaders, the church, the Christian leaders, and give account for what he was teaching. I'm going to say more about that, okay? Here's the thing, and I think I've said this before. There is this belief that Peter ran the church after Jesus' death. It is absolutely historically not true. It's not true. James the Just. Who was James? His brother. James the Just, who was well thought of in the city of Jerusalem. They called him the just man because he was just one of those guys who was just highly thought of, honest as the day is long. He was respected by Jews and Gentiles. He became the next leader of the church stayed headquartered in Jerusalem. And Peter and John were with him. They served almost like a trinity. But make no mistake about it, in the book of Acts, guess who makes decisions? James. Okay? James does. And remember, James is a thoroughgoing Jew. They all were. It was a Jewish movement. They continued, it says right in the book of Acts, go to the temple. They went to the temple. What we never know is, did they continue to offer sacrifices as they were supposed to? Never says. We assume they did not, but we don't know that for sure. But it was a Jewish sect that believed that Jesus was a prophet and the one sent by God. Does that make sense? Okay. And then, so then you can see there at the tail end of the italics, we're pretty certain that Paul was executed in 67 AD. Back up just a moment, there was another very significant death before Paul's death. James. What happened to James the Just, who led the church for like 32 years? 32 years, people. James the Just led the church in Jerusalem. He was executed. He was executed horribly by guess who? The son of the same high priest that had Jesus captured. His name was Herod Antipas. And what happened was, he was the high priest, the chief priest, the leader of the temple. And because James was so highly thought of, because this movement was expanding, the high priest, in between what I understand to be the Jewish kings placed by the Roman emperor, when there was like this few days of interregnum when there was no king, guess what he did? He moved and he had James the Just executed. You know how he did it? This must be a thing. They threw him off the highest point of the temple, which I think is the southeast corner. The highest point of the temple. They took him up on the wall and they threw him over. And guess what? The story, the legend is that he survived it barely. And they finished him off with stones. And what happened was, and this is even better, what happened was everybody was enraged. Why? Because James the Just was so highly thought of. The Jews were ticked off. The believers were ticked off. They were furious. And guess what? They had the new king, whose name I either can't see or it's not there. They had the new king removed the high priest because the king could place the high priest. And they got rid of Herod Antipas because of what he did to James the Just. Now, just a few years, what happened was there was more and more rebellion and craziness going on, which eventually led to the terrible destruction of Jerusalem. Remember that story? Under the Roman Emperor Vespasian. That happened in 70 AD. We know that for a fact. So they killed James the Just. After they killed James the Just, the believers, the Christians, who by that time some were calling them Christians, they realized, we need to get out of here. This is getting bad. This is getting really scary. And remember, Jesus told them, he warned them, that if they didn't stop, that the Romans were going to come in and just, he said, remember, not one stone would be left on the other. They're going to tear this place to pieces. And I think they remembered what Jesus said, and they started leaving the city. Because what happened just 7-8 years after they killed James, the Roman emperor apparently had enough. And Vespasian ordered all kinds of militias from all over the place, not just Rome, but wherever. He ordered them all to Jerusalem. And they killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people. I heard one place they crucified like 2,000 people. Can you imagine? They burned the place. They destroyed Jerusalem. Meanwhile, most of the believers had escaped. And we can talk more about that later. But they left the city. And they left behind them the Jewish people, many of whom were killed. Their homes, it was terrible what happened. That was the destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD. Okay, so the book of Acts does not recall, there's nothing about the destruction of Jerusalem. Why? Because it stops just about 3 years before it happens. Paul's executed, and then a year or two later is when Vespasian says, I have had enough of these people. And he sends his armies in and wipes the place out. Does that make sense? Is that a good time frame for you? Okay. Yes, James.
Is there any problems that takes up this?
Not in the New,
Events?
yeah, not in the New Testament, not in the canon. You can read about it. Sean, help me. The Jewish historian, what was his name? Josephus. You can read about it in Josephus. He was a Jewish historian. He chronicles the whole awful, horrible thing, and he chronicles the death of James.
Because he was prisoner under Titus, and he was the one trying to convince them
Yeah.
to surrender in the temple.
Yeah.
And the radicals didn't, and they ended up burning their own temple down.
Yeah, really bad news. But yeah, it's out there. It's just not in our Bibles. It is, Acts ends there. Great question, though. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, so jump a little bit. Let's talk about who wrote this book. Well, tradition has always said that it was none other than the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke, like I said today in the sermon. I think this. Because both of these documents begin, the Gospel and the Acts, begin with a tribute. He's doing it on behalf of this Greek noble person named Theophilus. By the way, I know a kid named Theophilus, who was named after the Theophilus in the Book of Acts. Both of those books begin with this tribute to this Theophilus. So the theory is, and by the way, and I am not a Greek scholar, barely got through it, but apparently the Greek in both of these books are just alike. So they believe that it was Luke the physician. By the way, Luke did not know Jesus, as I said in the sermon today. Luke, people think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were apostles. They were not. Because they wrote these books tens of dozens of years later, after. They would have all been dead, martyred. These are different people. But Luke, we know, because Paul says so, Luke was converted we believe under Paul's ministry. Late 30 years after the time of Jesus, okay? He was a convert, and he became one of Paul's assistants and helpers. We know, tradition says, that Luke was a physician. He was a doctor. He was a physician. He was a doctor before he became a Christian. He was a doctor to some degree after. As I said in the sermon, doctors were not highly thought of the way they are today, because they were thought to be practitioners of the dark arts, the occult. In the same way that witches were, the women who did herbs and stuff. And the belief was, if you're sick because you did something wrong. It's God's will. So why in the world would you want to mess with a doctor who's trying to make you right? It was thought that doctors practiced the dark arts because why? They're undoing what people said was the will of God. Does that make sense? Luke was one of these. And their doctoring was probably a mixture of hypnosis, placebos, herbs, potions, funny movements, all that kind of stuff. That's all they had, people. That's all they had. Luke was one of them, and he was a physician, okay? So primarily it's that attribute or tribute to Theophilus. So that Luke and Acts, the Gospel and Acts, are companion volumes. It's like the first one is all about Jesus, his ministry, and then the second volume is about his continuing ministry under his apostles and followers. Does that make sense? I always thought, why didn't they put Luke after John, and that way they'd be back to back? Wouldn't that make sense? Probably because maybe when they were doing the Gospels, they weren't sure. They just didn't know what we know now by virtue of archaeology and history or whatever. But I always thought it should have been like Mark, Matthew, John, Luke, Acts. Wouldn't that make more sense? But I wasn't in charge. Okay, so that's what we think. We don't know for 100% sure, but we assume it's Luke the physician. And it's volume 2 of his books. Joe.
Who was in charge?
That's another good story. The church fathers decided what books got into the Christian canon. But what we don't know was was there an absolute meeting where it was finally decided? What we know is there were different councils of the church. We're talking in the 2nd century, the hundreds, up into the 200s, where they would name the documents in the Christian Bible. And it changed. Some things that were in there, the next list, they wouldn't be in there. Because remember, they fought about what ought to be in there, right? They fought over it.
Revelation.
But we don't know. Yeah, Revelation, yeah. Most people think Revelation should never been in there. Some people think the book of James. I've come to think very differently about the book of James. But we don't know, Joe, for sure. It's one of the mysteries. It happened, I think, somewhere in the late 200s or early 300s, that there probably was a meeting somewhere, and they said, all right, guys, gotta make a decision. This is it. No more. This is it. We're done. Because there were a lot of other gospels. Did you know that? There were a lot of other gospels.
You also had the split between the Western Church and the Eastern.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
The Eastern Church has more, and the Ethiopians, they have even.
Yeah, they have even, John's right. Different sects of the church, like the Roman Catholics, they have more books. The Ethiopians do. The Eastern. So, but at some point, the good thing though is that minimally what's in our Bibles is in all of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We don't have others, but what we have, everybody has. All right, the Protestants I'm talking about. Yeah, John, you're exactly right. But I don't know, Joe, and nobody really does either. Okay, any more thoughts about who wrote it? Real quickly, we're coming down to the end here. I believe, and I think modern scholarship really feels that the book of Acts, in many ways, is a defense of Paul's ministry. It's a defense of Paul's ministry. Well, why would that be? Why is it that? Isn't it just a bunch of great stories of missionary journeys and shipwrecks? And it is all that. But primarily, remember, Luke was Paul's friend and companion. He's writing to defend his friend's ministry. Why would that be? This is why. Because Paul was the one who really pushed hard to open the church. Let's call it the movement. Because it still really wasn't a church like we think today. It was a movement to non-Jews. It was a Jewish movement. It was a sect within Judaism, right? And Paul was the one who started preaching differently. And he's called in twice, and we're going to go through this. And they're saying, Paul, what exactly are you out there teaching those people up in Turkey and Asia Minor? What exactly are you telling them? The accusation was that it's not what he was telling the Gentiles, it was what he was telling the Jews. It appears, or they thought he was telling the Jews that you guys can give up all that stuff. Don't worry about what you eat. Don't worry about the Sabbath or all those other great traditions and festivals and celebrations, because in Jesus it's all new. It's a whole new thing. Now he denies it. They bring him in front of the church, or the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, and they ask him to give in a defense. What are you doing out there? What's going on? And he says, these people are being saved and healed, and we're going to read all about this stuff. And then what are you telling them? What are you preaching out there? And scholars say he had two fingers crossed behind his back, telling them the truth they needed to hear, but not all of it. And the other thing was Paul an apostle? Was Paul one of the originals? No, he was not. The rule was if you're an apostle, you had to have known the Lord and walked with the Lord before his crucifixion, minimally. Paul did not. Paul came later. Paul never knew. And he says it in his letters. I did not know Jesus in the flesh. When he says that, it means the earthly Jesus, the man, the human being. I did not know him. But I've got one up on all you dudes. I knew he came to me in Revelations. He appeared to me first on the road to Damascus. Damascus. Remember that story? We'll read about that. That's in there. But in other times, he received other revelations, he says. The risen, and Paul almost never calls Jesus, Jesus. He calls him Christ, or Christ Jesus. Things started to change. And all those good Jewish guys back in Jerusalem who were keeping the Sabbath, who were worshiping in the temple, who were going to the synagogue, dietary laws, keeping, not eating pork and all that other stuff you weren't supposed to eat, not eating with people you're not supposed to eat with. They're continuing to be good, observant Jews. It's just that they believe that Jesus was God's prophet. And they're not liking what they hear. This guy who elbows his way in and calls himself one of us, an apostle. And so the validity of his apostleship is being questioned over and over. Now, is this news to anybody? Everybody know that? Yeah. And I think Luke goes to great lengths to try to soften this thing down. Because if you read in Paul's letters, it is snarky. He goes, the so-called leaders of the church, the so-called pillars, I work hard. He says this, I work harder than they do. I met the Lord, the risen Christ. They only knew the man. He says this stuff. We just don't see it. So it is largely, I think, Luke's defense of Paul's ministry. He's telling all the exploits, all the ways God used him. And I do believe God did use Paul. But make no mistake about it, there was enmity between the Jewish Jerusalem leaders and Paul, this guy who persecuted the believers and then had this mystical experience on the road to Damascus and suddenly did a 180. And they're like, I don't know if we should believe this. In fact, there's a part in the early book of Acts where they're afraid of him. They don't even want him around. They're afraid that he's lying, that he's faking it. Okay, so that's one of the issues there. They're not convinced that, number one, he's really not an apostle. They think of him as more of an evangelist, but dude, you can't be an apostle because you didn't know the Lord before the crucifixion. Does it make sense? Okay. And then there's several theological issues, but primarily it's all about what are we? Are we Jews? And if these new people coming in, this is a Jewish thing. Jesus is a Jew. These Gentiles, so do they have to become one of us? Do their men have to be circumcised? What can they eat? What are they restricted from? The first council of the church was all about what you can eat, and you get circumcised or not. And that's the controversy. And there's other little squabbles in between. Linda, did you ever hear that?
I just looked at encounter with Jesus, Paul's encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus count as him having some contact.
Well, Paul thinks so.
Yeah.
Yeah, Paul, absolutely. Paul says it all the time. In his letters, he's always saying, yes, I didn't know the Jesus in the flesh, but I've had all these. And he gets to the point where he actually calls it his gospel. Did you know that? My gospel. Differentiating it from some of the stuff that's being taught in Jerusalem. Make no mistake about it. He calls it my gospel. Where did I get it? I got it directly from the Lord in a vision and a revelation. He came to me. So make no mistake about it. He's given me authority. You may think you're the pillars of the church, but he came to me. Yeah. And we're going to show you this. We're going to lay it side by side. The book of Acts compared to Galatians. He's really snarky in Galatians and Corinthians. That we just gloss over and we don't really think about it. We don't really get it. But it's there. Joe.
Well, then what happened after James was executed?
Well, most of the believers fled the city.
Right.
Yeah, they just fled. And the thought is there's a place, it's known as a wadi, which is like a wide valley. There's a wadi up that's actually now, I think, it's either Jordan or Syria, where they think most of them fled to. That they left, and then the Christians started to disperse.
That was the end of the journey.
No, they took it out of Jerusalem. The church left Jerusalem.
But Paul was still active.
Paul was in Rome at the time, imprisoned and about to get his head chopped off. during all this upheaval, it's called the uprising, the Jewish uprising in Jerusalem. And then, like I said, in 70, Vespasian had enough. They just jumped on his last raw nerve, and he went in and he just wiped him out. Just wiped him out. Does that make sense? That's what happened.
Was Vespasian going to put the Roman gods in the temple? And that was what they said, no, not in our temple.
Was it Vespasian or was it Caligula? There were some bad ones. I don't remember right off, but I've heard the stories where they threatened to put statuary inside the temple. Well, there's nothing worse to a Jew than put an idol inside their sacred temple.
Especially to a Roman god.
Yeah, I mean that's just. And then one of them, didn't he sacrifice a pig on the altar or something horrible like that? Well, I'll look it up. But they did this stuff to mock the Jews, and they just went nuts. Yeah, John.
They went up into what we call Turkey and
Turkey,
Greece.
yeah.
And the
Asia Minor,
Balkans,
yeah.
and even into
Yeah.
Egypt.
Yeah, the church scattered. The believers scattered, and they took their faith with them. In the meantime, Jerusalem was a nightmare, just an utter nightmare. It was destroyed.
How did it come together?
Well, under different leaders, they repaired the thing, whatever. But the temple, as you know, was never rebuilt. There's nothing there now, other than a platform and a mosque. They never repaired it. That was the second temple. Yeah. Okay, one more, and then we're going to go. Jamie.
How was news about everything that was going on? How was it being
Communicated,
indicated, or how are people in different locations?
Letters.
What was it?
letters with messengers, yeah. That's how, think about Paul. That's how he communicated with all of his churches up in Asia Minor and Greece. Because that's where most of Paul's journeys were up there. That's what he said. I guess they had people that rode animals or went by boat or
Rome
something.
had a very good system.
Yeah.
Remember,
It's a
the
mail.
Roman Empire was at its
Yeah.
height, and they could travel.
Yeah. It may take a few weeks, but you would get there. It would get there. But yeah, that's how they communicated. And I'm sure they did it. They had to be secretive about some of it, But yeah, that's how they knew what was going on. But, was Paul aware of, when Paul was in Rome, and we think Peter was there at the same time, we think both of them were executed under Nero, because remember, Nero was a bad guy. And he killed all the Christians and Jews. He got ticked about something, and he would wasn't there a fire?
The fire in Rome that devastated, yeah.
And Nero blamed the Christians on it. Christus, the followers of Christus. And we think that's probably when he had enough of Peter and Paul, just got rid of them both. Yeah. Okay, isn't this fun and exciting? I think it is. I love the Bible. Okay, we'll see you guys next Sunday.